It's Tuesday, June 28th, 2022. It's 6:30 in the evening. Let the record show that councilors are here except for Councilor Morton, who is excused, and Councilor Jobe, who is also excused. Council members, you have the minutes of the June 14th meeting in your packet, and do they meet with your approval?
Move to accept as written.
Second.
Motion second. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
And opposed. Motion carries. City Recorder Johnson, would you please administer the oath to City Manager Kenna West, please?
Raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Kenna West, having been duly appointed
I, Ken West, having been duly appointed
by the Independent City Council,
by the Independent City Council,
say on oath
say on oath
that I will support the Constitution and laws
that I will support the Constitution and laws
of the United States,
of the United
the
States,
state of Oregon,
the state of Oregon,
and the charter and ordinances
and the charter and ordinances
of the City of Independence,
of the City of Independence,
and that I will perform the duties
that I will perform the duties
of the office of City Manager
of the office of City Manager
to the best of my abilities.
to the best of my abilities.
So help me God.
So help me.
Congratulations.
On behalf of the council and our community, welcome City Manager West. We're glad to have you here. Is there any public comment that needs to be made? I don't see anybody rushing to the microphone. Was that, no? Okay, thank you. So we're going to go immediately to visitor presentation. We have Brent DeMoe from the Polk County Family and Community Outreach, and he's going to speak to us from over at the staff chair. Good evening and welcome to City Council.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and everybody else. How are you all?
Good, how are you?
Good to be here. So again, it's Brent DeMoe from Polk County Family and Community Outreach. I'm here to give an update on how things have been going at the Annex location, and to tell you guys a little bit about how we have spent the dollars that you have given us for the first 3 months. You have a handout. I'm not going to read it word for word. I'm just going to hit some highlights and then really answer any questions that you might have, okay? So first, we started providing services 3 days a week on March 1st in the Monmouth Independence area. Quickly realized that the need was greater than we thought it was going to be, and on June 15th, we moved to 5 days a week with 3 full-time bilingual bicultural staff, and then an occasional 4th staff to help with backup. The Resource Center helps with a bunch of different needs and services, but we've highlighted a few here, and we've also talked about what we did with your initial investment of $25,000. So 5,000 of those dollars went immediately just for startup to get us our computers and our desks and all of the things to stand up an office, which we did in 2 days. And then the other $20,000 went directly to client support. The types of things, the top things that we helped with were things like rent, deposits, utility assistance, beds for kids, school equipment, application fees for housing and other things, IDs and birth certificates, and job readiness supplies. With those funds, the $20,000 actually leveraged an additional $7,526 from other funding streams that we had, braiding and blending your money with other money to help families more efficiently. One of the biggest referrals we made to was Community Action Agency's Energy Assistance Program. We were able to connect people to an additional $27,000 of energy assistance. And the interesting thing about that, and that served 22 households, 15 of those households had never received that assistance before. And energy assistance is one that you can get 1 time per year each year if you qualify. It really tells us that locating in Monmouth Independence, and when we did the report to Monmouth last week, the numbers were very similar. We are connecting with people who did not know or did not have access to some of these services before. And even though Dallas is just a short distance away, we all know that that can be a barrier because of transportation. Staff also informed me this week that they are in the process of picking which 2 days they're going to stay open past 5 o'clock to be able to serve families that are working, to be able to get there between the hours of 5 and 6. So when we have those set, I'll update y'all and let you know when those days are. Staff really wanted me to talk about some of the success stories. There's one here at the bottom. I'm going to read through it, and I have another one that just came in on my phone. A lot of times people come in and they've heard, hey, I heard I could get a gas card here, or I heard I can get diapers for my kids. But we never just do the one and done. We never just give them what they want and send them on their way. We do an intake with every single person to find out what's going on with them, to see if there's other things that we might be able to help them with that they didn't know about. And I think both of these stories I'm going to share with you represent that. So the one that you have at the bottom of your handout talks about a client who came in and all they thought they needed was some help with gas vouchers. But after doing that intake, we learned that she was commuting from Independence to Corvallis for chemotherapy for a recent cancer diagnosis. We provided the client with gas vouchers, but also connected them with the Oregon Health Plan mileage reimbursement program, and that is now covering the ongoing cost of traveling to her appointments. It's just something that she didn't know about, but the resource connectors that we have, they're really experts in just about every resource that is available in the Valley. And even though somebody might have OHP, it doesn't mean that they know about all the ancillary benefits that come with that. This other story, interestingly, also has to do with chemotherapy and cancer, but it's worth reading as well. The Polk County Resource Center was able to help a young family stay housed. The parents of two rent an apartment in Independence. They have 2 kids. Soon after giving birth to the second child, the mother was diagnosed with cancer, and she had to begin chemotherapy treatments. And over the course of a few months, the treatments made her very, very sick. This required Dad to have to stay home from work to care for the newborn. This resulted in a dramatic drop in their income. But recently, the mom started new treatment, and she's feeling a lot better, and Dad was able to return to work. The Resource Center was able to assist this family in getting caught up on their rent from the time both parents were out of work. The father is now back full-time, and the family is self-sufficient. Those are just a couple of the many examples of ways that the staff at that annex are using your dollars. Sometimes it's money, and sometimes it's connection to other resources. You can see on here, in less than 3 months, they did 200 referrals to other partnering agencies. We have a food delivery program to deliver food to people on the evenings and weekends in case they can't make it to a food bank. 237 people in 2.5 months we've been delivering food to weekly. The top referrals that we're doing: Energy Assistance, Department of Human Services, Northwest Human Services, Behavioral Health, and Mid-Valley Parenting. Everything else you guys can read on here, but I just want to take a breath and say thank you for that initial trust and investment of the $25,000. It's been really great. Monmouth and Independence are the only 2 cities in Polk County that have given the Resource Center such a flexible pot of funds to be used when people don't qualify. I was sharing coffee earlier this week with Kenna and Bob that some funding streams, you have to get an eviction notice before you can get help, or you have to get laid off before you can get help, or you have to have your power shut off before you can get help. We want to come in the day before and stop those things from happening. And that's what these dollars are able to allow us to do. Not everybody is going to fit a government or some other funder's funding stream or their requirements. A lot of people can fall through the cracks if they are just over income or if they're just not specific enough of a problem. So these dollars have been super helpful.
Questions for Brent?
I just have a couple comments. I think your success stories bring home the point that if you know who knows, you're ahead of the game, and that's part of the problem, obviously. But kudos to you, Brent. I mean, this has been an amazing resource you brought to our community. I mean, we all knew it was needed, but it's nice to see it quantified in this manner. Thanks very much.
So I guess just a quick comment as well. I want to thank you for coming. This is amazing. But every time you come, I learn something new. Mm-hmm. You supplied me with your fabulous resource guide that, yes, I use at work to help refer folks. Mm-hmm. And now I'll be looking into the OHP reimbursement to see if they'll cover some of the mental health travel as well as medical travel. So thank you so much.
How many of the people that this agency serves are reoccurring?
It would really depend on the service. So the agency being my agency. So there are certain things that you can get every day. We don't deny people food or access to food, hygiene supplies. You can't come in and get a gas card every day. There has to be circumstances. You have to have a job interview, a doctor appointment, or something like that. We won't just hand out a gas card because you say you need some gas. We do that intake. We find out what's what. It's pretty individualized, but I can tell you for the most part, once a week for a gas card if there really is a reoccurring appointment. Families that are receiving rental assistance or energy assistance, a lot of those funding streams, it's one-time help. You can only get help one time in a calendar year. We use like a hodgepodge of requirements from other agencies to decide how we spend the City of Independence's money. So I can tell you with confidence, we're not going to help a client every single month with a different issue. We really have to be good stewards of these dollars, and we try to help folks that have a plan for sustainability and that we can just get them over that hump, and then they have a plan after that. But there are other programs that can help people longer term if they don't have a sustainability plan, and we refer to those ones.
No, I appreciate that, because I think the worst thing we can do is create a program of dependency. So if we're creating a program of dependency, then it's going to hurt people in the long run to have this type of program. But if you're creating something that people can get over that hump and then move on, I think that's really beneficial.
Yeah, and assuming that we enter into an agreement for another 3 months, 6 months, or a year, I would like to be able to come back after I have a nice data set to actually be able to tell you what's reoccurring and what's not to better answer your question. But we're in alignment on that thinking for sure.
Thank you. Councilor Takis? Brett, I just want to say that, you know, obviously several of us have attended the homeless planning meetings, and the effort that you're talking about here, coupled with the other efforts that are going on, I really like the prevention focus that, and I think that's something that you were talking about, is helping people before they're in even worse trouble, helping make that jump and making the connections, the navigators helping people get connected up so that they can stay in their home, and pointing out where the other resources are. And I'm excited about that, so thank you for taking the time to share the information with us. Appreciate it.
And if allowed, I would just like to say 2 other quick things that came to mind with your questions. The first one is we worked, and did you say yes?
That was a, yeah.
Okay. My goodness. I worked with both Kenna and Bob, and we created a flyer in English and Spanish that we mailed to everybody in the City of Independence, letting them know that if they need some help or if they're falling behind on any of their bills, that this resource is available. In 13 years, that's the first time with Monmouth and Independence that we've done something like that, so that's very cool. And the other thing I wanted to say is when we help folks with rental assistance, part of it is helping the folks pay their rent, but the other part, equal part, is making sure that the landlord gets paid. Because if we don't have landlords and we don't have rentals, we're not going to be able to house people in places. So it's very much thinking about that business aspect as well.
Great. Thanks so much. Appreciate you taking the time to come in.
I'll come back anytime.
All right. Thank you. Sheriff, you get to make the next presentation. There is an action item at the end of this, council members. Good evening and welcome to the Independence City Council.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and council members. The reason I'm here is Senate Bill 111 started in 2008. It's a requirement for each county to have a response plan for when deadly force is used. We call it the Law Enforcement Intentional Use of Deadly Physical Force Response Plan. I'll just say Senate Bill 111 going forward, it's a little quicker. What this is a framework for how the investigation should go, not necessarily how the investigation is conducted. It talks about how what the agency's responsibilities are for record keeping, for reporting to DOJ, that kind of thing. And so part of that is a planning authority committee gets together. Myself and the district attorney are part of, are the co-chairs of that. We include every police chief as well in the city or in the county. We don't have to have everyone, but it's whole county, we all work together. It requires a public member, and it also requires a union member from one of the local police department unions. And so we all got together and we look at this, and we do have to review this once a year. We don't necessarily have to make changes every year, But there was a change that we added into this, and really the only change that we did was added specific reporting things that we have to provide to DOJ. It was very vague before about you just need to provide information to them. But really what it talks about is, their age, their gender, the particulars, if there's mental health issues, that kind of thing, so that there is some kind of report that the state gets. And so we actually spelled that out in this. And so after the committee gets together and looks at it, that we then had a public hearing in May. And then at the public hearing, there was no issues, and the committee voted to approve and move forward. And the next step is we all have to come, or I have to come to each of the city councils and present this and ask for approval. Chief Mason was involved in that. And so the input going into it, it's not like, it's not unknown to the police department here. So when we go to each of the councils, 2/3 of the council have to approve it before we can send it to the state. The councils don't have the ability to make changes. However, there are, if there's an issue or something that we can address or maybe clarify, we can always take that back, and then we have to start the process over again. But everything in this plan is spelled out in statute. There's very little subjective information in it. This is what's required of law enforcement in each county in the state of Oregon. And so, I forgot to mention the tribal government is involved in it as well. So, it can go forward a little bit too, if you would. So, in this plan, just so folks know, again, it's not about the investigation. It's about kind of the direction that it needs to go and who does what and why. The district attorney is the one that gets the evidence, looks and presents it to grand jury, and that is the process he's decided to do, which is standard pretty much across the state. That is where the justification or not justification of the use of deadly force is determined based on state law, case law, that kind of thing. So this plan doesn't negate any policies that each individual police department has. We have to include all the policies from each of the police departments within this document. So it just proves essentially to the state that there are these policies in place that meet state statute. And so that is really where we're at. And I'd really like for approval if that's something you're willing to do, and I'd like to answer any questions that you guys might have regarding this plan that we're required to do by the state.
So before we get to questions, I just want to let people know that for our audience, we have in the packet an extensive outline of what the agreement is and a whole PowerPoint presentation. So we've all read our packets in advance, and so I just want to let folks know that this is not a surprise to us. Are there questions for the sheriff this evening?
I'd just like to ask if Chief Mason has anything to add to the presentation that, okay.
You good, Chief? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Since this is an action item, Karen, could you put on the screen what we need to do to fulfill the requirement? On your screen, council members, there is a proposed.
So if I may,
yes, please.
I'd like to move to approve Polk County's law enforcement intentional use of deadly physical force response plan.
I have a motion.
Second.
Second by Councilor Takis. Is there discussion? Hearing no discussion, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
And opposed. Motion carries. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Nice to see you, Chief. Appreciate it.
So
Excuse me.
just two quick things. Sheriff Garten, thank you much for a clear, concise PowerPoint. When I reviewed that, it really took care of any possible questions. Second is at the end of the PowerPoint, it says policies for the following departments are attached, but they were not, and I understand why they wouldn't be. Might I get a copy of our city plan? Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks, Chief. Appreciate that. Okay. Sheriff, you're welcome to stay for the rest of the evening, or I know that you have a few morning meetings also, and so have a pleasant evening. I'm going to move forward with my report, 7.1. I had the pleasure of speaking at the recent opening of the grocery outlet, the ribbon cutting. It's a great event. The line went all the way down to the liquor store, and so there were, that was 385 people that were in line when the count was made. So it was a wonderful time, and I think many of the council members were also there. Recently attended the LOC Board of Directors meeting, and where we talk about statewide issues, legislation coming up, training and events that are coming on. And I also want to make mention that our city manager is also a member of the Board of Directors, representing city managers in the state of Oregon. And so there are two of us there. I'm also on the LOC Strategic Planning group. It was a small group, and I was honored to be invited to participate in that. We also had our Council of Governments meeting where we approved all the things that the Council of Governments does. I want to call your attention to something that we're addressing. Our legislative committee, we're taking a really strong levels of action in the federal legislation that passed on the ARPA funds and the IIJA. I can't remember all the words that go with the it's the federal funding that's coming down. They have a Buy American requirement in there, which sounds really, really good, but in the age of globalization, we can't get sewer pumps made in America that qualify. And it's not just us, it's around the state and around the country. There are lots of challenges with getting the parts and the equipment, and it's becoming a real thing. I was talking to our Public Works Director, and he said the same things that have been mentioned by other cities around the state. And contractors come over recently looking to bid our 9th Street, and they said the timeline with the Buy America is hugely elongated. The supply chain is a problem. The cost is going to go up. So we are individually, I've reached out to our congressional members and their staff. The Council of Governments is the 43-member governments. We're reaching out. We're working through the governor's office and both the League of Oregon Cities and the Association of Oregon Counties. We're all saying we have a problem. And through Sean Irvine's help, we've been able to personalize it, so taking it out of the abstract to talking about real specific kinds of things. I just want to call your attention to that. You're going to hear more about that going forward. But on a positive note, you have all seen the ODOT trucks. Yep. They have been on Monmouth Street filling potholes, and not just filling little things. There are big, long stretches, and that's not just the quickie little fix. Those are long-term quality. That's as good as it gets unless you're going to rebuild the whole road. And I just want to say that I went out with our Public Works Director and our friends from Monmouth. Earlier this year, we had the maintenance director and the ODOT region director. We asked them to come and visit us, and we took them on a road trip. And we even have some pictures of Officer Indy in a pothole, and he had a frowny face on. And now there has now been a picture of Officer Indy with a smiling face because he likes filled-in potholes. All teasing aside, we were able to make a case to show them the challenge, and they were going, wow, you have a real issue here. And so maintenance and improvements were made. And it was mentioned in another meeting that other people are going, wow, how did they get that? Maybe we should adopt the independence model. And so I'm really excited that we're getting the service that we have, and I'm going to be sending a letter on behalf of the council and our city to the director of ODOT, lauding them for doing the stuff that they've done because it's good for us. So anyway, that's what I've got to report at this point.
I applauded them as I drove by.
Yay! Because,
There's one in the corner by my house that just about eats my car.
There you go. So,
Very happy. Very, very happy.
Are they going to come back and fix what they've done though, right? I mean, when you drive down the road, it's like you're in a hydraulic vehicle. You go up one side and then you go down the
Yeah.
other. Like, that can't be,
well, some of those bumps are going to squish down over time, a little, and we're not on a schedule, Highway 51 is not scheduled to be rebuilt probably during this decade or more. And so, but that should keep the pavement from getting worse.
and then they forgot to do the big potholes across from Mindy's.
It's not finished.
It's not finished.
It's not finished. They've been doing hunks and pieces.
Okay.
And like today, they had the big road graders out, and they did another whole long section. So there's more being done, and so it's not completed. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chief Mason.
We're giving Kenna one more meeting off, even though she's, been on the job for 24 hours.
Yeah, that's right,
Good evening, and this will be my last city manager interim report. So I'm going to start with Independence Day. Still a lot of work being done in preparation for this weekend's events, and ticket sales seem to be going very well. I know some of you up there have been selling tickets, so thank you for that. As of yesterday, we had sold about 3,000 tickets. Questions? Thought I heard somebody with a question. Okay, next up, MyNet. The general manager interviews are complete, and we have a special board meeting tomorrow night to consider a final applicant, and we're hoping to enter into negotiations to fill that vacant position, and we're really excited about it.
Chief, what was his job before he was interim? The interim GM, what was his job before
Oh,
that?
he was I believe the title was operations manager, but he
Yeah,
had
'cause
had
he-
several titles.
He came to speak to us not too long
Yeah.
ago, right? Okay,
Yep,
okay.
and he had several titles within the
Okay.
organization. Transportation and growth management. We had applied for a grant to study parking in the downtown, and we were notified yesterday that we received that. So the state will be working with us and analyzing existing and anticipated parking conditions in downtown and looking for a good solution. So we're kind of excited about that one. Fred especially is excited, and he will be managing that for our end.
When does that begin and supposed to end?
That is a great question. I think that they're going to be in touch to start the ball rolling. So being a state project, I'm just going to kind of look over my shoulder and see if Sean gives me a 2-month or what do you think, Sean?
They can't come by next week?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, okay.
I like it when Sean has to be the voice of reason, like it's probably going to be the end of the year. That's good. Legislation appropriation. You'll recall that we received a $2 million award from the state legislature for the 9th Street pump station. That paperwork has come through and has been signed. So that is good and moving forward. Today we had the pre-bid meetings on site with contractors, and bids for phase 1 of that project will open July 28th, so it is moving along. F Street Bridge. At the city's request, the contractor has agreed to open the bridge for the 4th of July. So it's going to open on Friday, and it will be open through the 4th, so that we'll be able to have another route to get around town when we close the main route. It will not be the permanent opening. It should be really soon after that, though. The following week, they are scheduled for the walkthrough with the engineer and punch list with our Public Works Department. Osprey Lane parking. So this has been a topic for a while, but Public Works was able to get those signs installed today. So right now we have just a couple, well, there may be no cars left now. When the signs went up, people were parked there, right? And so we put some notices on those cars asking them to move and explaining that the signs were now up, so it's officially a no parking side of the street. And we also put out some social media on that today. We won't start enforcement on that until sometime later in the week when everybody's had an opportunity to adapt to the change. And the last thing I have is bus trolley stop locations. And I'm going to make a quick route and hand these out. Karen, I made one for you.
Thank you.
I need you to be set upside down.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So a little while back, council gave staff the ability to do some of this kind of work without having to go through a city council process. So we have determined where the stops are going to be for the new trolley service. And your packet has in the front street views of where those stops would be. And then in the back is like a bird's eye view, so you can kind of see it on a map. A little better idea of the exact placement. There are 7 stops planned. Some of them are on the state highway, and we have our next step is to apply to the state for permission to put those in on the state highway. And then at the very end of your packet is a request that Chariot's made to move the stop for the Route 45 bus route from one location on 7th Street to another location on 7th Street, because they're going to do a route change and run that bus a different direction in our kind of our back area of town for ease of transportation in their route.
Great. Thank you for keeping us informed.
You bet. And that is all I have, unless there's any questions for Kenneth's staff.
Okay. So we're going to move forward. And Karen, do we have Carrie on the line? Okay.
Hello, Gary. This is Karen. You're on speaker in the council chambers.
Wonderful.
Good evening, Carrie. John McCardle here. Can you hear me all right?
This is David Klein.
Okay. You're on TV. You're on the speaker, and council is here, and a few people are in our audience. Can you hear me okay?
I appreciate that, Mr. Mayor. Yes, I can.
Thank you.
It isn't as clear as it normally would be from the present, but we'll do the best we can under the circumstances.
Thank you. And to let folks know, Carrie's adjusting her life to be able to be with us. She's not able to travel at this point, and so we're glad she's able to join us. For those of you who don't know, Carrie Conley is our city attorney, and so we're glad that she's able to be with us tonight as a opening for this. Homelessness, houselessness is an issue that is affecting all communities across the United States, and Independence is, we're one of those. And Chief and I have been working for a while to get this meeting scheduled so that Carrie can let us know what the state rules are, what the court cases are, what the individual rights of people, so that we know what the rules are. We're not going to solve the problems tonight. Tonight is focused on information and education, and so I'm going to ask the council focus their questions and comments tonight clearly for information and for understanding. We're going to have a number of work sessions in the coming months where we'll get a chance to have more broad spectrum conversation, but what I'm hoping for tonight is that we can get information and understanding what the rules are that we're going to have to be working with as we move forward, because we all have the same concerns. We want to make sure our community looks good, that people are able to be treated respectfully in all ways, both the general public and people experiencing homelessness. So with that as a preparatory comments, Carrie, can I turn it to you and let you carry the ball from here, please?
Absolutely. Is everybody able to see?
You're a lot louder now, and so just talk for a moment here. And poor Jason just blew out his eardrums with the headphones. Just talk for a moment so we can get a good sound check here, please.
Okay. So tell me, wow, that does sound really loud, and it's echoing back on me.
Is that better now?
Let me keep talking, and you guys tell me if it's better.
Is that okay with everybody? Okay, we're at a good place now. So Carrie, it's to you.
I appreciate it. Are people able to see the PowerPoint that I prepared with your staff?
Yes, they can. We have it on the screen, both at our desks and for those that are in the audience tonight.
Wonderful. All right, so Mayor McCarter, you really covered a lot of my preliminary points that I wanted to make. I did want to just explain a little further. I'm a month out from a serious bike wreck, so I'm not allowed to drive. That doesn't mean that I can't provide you with legal advice, but sometimes I might grasp for words. So be patient, I will get there. And I'm progressively improving, so I appreciate your patience on that point. I want to acknowledge that there are individuals on the council and probably in the audience who are far better versed on this topic than I am, particularly as it pertains to your community. So to the extent that I'm either getting anything wrong, or you'd like to augment, or you just want to ask questions to make sure that the audience is clear on what the law is and how it applies to the facts of your community, I'm open to that. I know that Kenna, welcome, Kenna West, the new city manager. She is going to be running interference, as is Mayor McCardle, to ensure that I can answer your questions. And they get posed. I don't mind being interrupted, so let's ask questions as they come up rather than holding them to the end. One of the interesting aspects, just to illustrate how quickly this area is evolving, is when the statutes were written, they were drafted to refer to persons experiencing homelessness, or but the terminology has even modified now. It's they're individuals who are unhoused. That's a new term. It's probably a better term, but you'll see that my presentation uses the word homelessness because I'm reflecting the statutes as they're currently written. So don't think I'm being insensitive. I'm just trying to be legally accurate. The goal here is just to give everybody the same baseline background. As the mayor was explaining, we're going to have a lot more conversations about options for the community of independence and your broader community. I'm going to give you some illustrations of how the law might apply to your code and your community. There's nothing written in stone as to what you must do or amendments that have to be made. So I just want to emphasize that at the get-go, and then we'll circle back to that idea. I've had some experience in other communities struggling with this issue. I know it can be very difficult. So just know that we're all in this together, and everybody's developing something that fits their community. So with that, Karen, if you could turn to the second slide. Homelessness is, and PSU has defined this as like regular access to safe, adequate, stable housing. So it's not just housing. There's characteristics that are required in order to take somebody out of the state of being homeless. Third slide. Next slide. Homelessness can be attributed in people's minds and lore to a number of different factors, but it is really statistically shown that homelessness pertains primarily to the lack of housing, the lack of affordable housing. As of 2019, there was a report commissioned by the Oregon Community Foundation that showed that Oregon's high rent makes crisis more severe here in Oregon than in most states. Left unabated, it's just going to increase our homeless population. Next slide, Karen. Oh, I'm sorry. I wanted to point out that I understand I'm not the only item on your agenda. I'm going to try to move relatively quickly so you can get to the remaining agenda items. And with the recognition, we're going to be revisiting this issue moving forward. So if I'm going too fast, let me know. But I don't want to take up too much of your time.
And Carrie, to just let you know that we do have your slides were included in our packet in advance, so council's had a chance to see them prior to tonight's meeting.
Wonderful. Okay, well good. Maybe you have some questions poised as I go through this. I am going to touch on each of the slides, but I will try not to belabor particularly the initial factual first 10 slides. So slide 4, talked about the myth that homelessness is difficult to predict. The actual fact is that house affordability predicts the severity of homelessness. Slide 5 brings it in a little closely to the West Coast. Oregon, California, and Washington face higher rates of homelessness. But the myth is that that's because of the lax laws and the fact that we provide shelters to homelessness, so maybe we attract a higher population here. But the fact is actually that the West Coast faces one of the largest affordable housing shortages in the country. And that's illustrated even more clearly on slide 6 with regard to U.S. statistics. You can see that as the rent rates go up on that bottom axis, the number of homeless per 10,000 individuals increases also on that vertical axis. So that Oregon, Washington, California, Hawaii are some of the the states with the highest rates of homelessness. Bringing it a little closer to home, slide 7, Oregon's population is 1.3% of the U.S. population. However, our homeless rate is double that. And this was in 2019. So here in 2022, numbers are different, but this just gives you a sense of the trends even 3 years ago. Slide 8.
Carrie, can I interrupt you for just a second?
Hold on, Carrie. Hold on, Councilor Core.
I just want to state, because I don't think it's anywhere in the slides, HUD defines affordable housing as housing for which an occupant is paying no more than 30% for housing costs and utilities. So it's not just a housing number, it's also utilities, which makes it even more difficult.
Did you hear that, Carrie?
I couldn't hear it. No, I'm sorry.
What Councilor Core was saying is that HUD defines affordability as 30% of your income. And
No more than 30, yeah.
Of your, excuse me?
No more than 30% of your income for housing and utilities.
30% of your income for housing and utilities.
So you have to be within 30% of your income for it to be affordable? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes.
That makes sense. And that's interesting, Councilor Core, because I have a specific note here to ask you with regard to the Polk and Marion County numbers that Mid-Willamette Valley Homeless Alliance issued. It's on their website a couple days ago. If you had any information to share on the data. So thank you for contributing, and please keep it up.
The numbers are correct in the briefing, but they don't reflect youth homelessness. It's only adults.
They don't reflect, and I missed that last word.
They don't reflect youth homelessness. They only reflect adults.
Youth. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I heard usefulness, and I'm like, that just can't be what it is.
There you go. Okay, keep going. Are we on point in time?
We are.
Okay, continue, please.
I think the primary statistic to draw from this slide is simply that in 1 year, the number of unhoused individuals increased approximately 20% from 2021 to 2022, based on the Mid-Willamette Valley Homeless Alliance point-in-time count. And again, Councilor Core, I'll defer to you. Do you have any information on that point in time that you'd like to share?
Are you talking about numbers, Carrie?
Maybe about anything in particular. If in some communities, they point out that the point in time isn't actually that accurate, that the numbers are probably undercounted here because of the inability to access individuals who are unhoused.
Yeah, there's lots of different factors. Sometimes it's just the fact that we can't get enough volunteers to do the count, so we can only go with what we've got. But in Polk County, and these are just the adult numbers. The numbers that you have in the briefing are just the adult numbers. Falls City is 7, Dallas 8, Monmouth Independence 10, Salem Polk 101. So 126 total for Polk County. That was the 2020 PIT count. 2022, I'm sorry, 2022.
Thank you. And then the next slide, slide 9, which illustrates unhoused population. To me, what this slide stands for is the correlation between the lack of affordable housing and the increase in unhoused population. The Polk and Marion County region has a 1,200 unit deficit. I think that's pretty incredible. Polk County is meeting, go ahead. Sorry, I thought I heard something. Okay.
No, you're fine,
Polk
Carrie.
County
Keep
is only
going.
meeting 72% of its need or demand, while Marion County is meeting 69% of its need. So these numbers simply illustrate what the court and the legislature are recognizing, which is that we can't pretend that there is a place for unhoused individuals to go. And so moving to slide 10, let's launch into the law that is developing as a result of the data that we just covered. I grew up in a small town in Oregon, the Dow, except for a period when garage niche were imported. Garage niche were importing individuals and turning them onto our streets. I had zero experience with individuals experiencing homelessness. And in that context, historically, courts have upheld laws that prohibit the occupation of public space. But Martin v. Boise was a Ninth Circuit case decided in 2019, and it expressly acknowledged that if individuals have nowhere else to go, it's unconstitutional to criminalize occupying public space. Martin v. Boise held that an ordinance violates the Eighth Amendment, and let me just clarify, the Eighth Amendment is the amendment that prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. So essentially criminalizing, imposing criminal sanctions against homeless individuals for sleeping outdoors on public property is unconstitutional when no alternative shelter is available. Slide 11. So in 2019, I worked with your city, I worked with a number of cities who just started scrambling to figure out what does Martin v. Boise require if we can't criminalize sleeping outdoor on public property when there's no alternative shelter. What does that mean? How is law enforcement supposed to decide if an individual has access to adequate alternative shelter? And Martin v. Boise made it even more confusing. They did not want to draw a bright line. They specifically stated it was a narrow holding in slide 11. This footnote 8 specifically required an individualized analysis if cities wanted to enforce their no camping, no sleeping in public parks. And before you could enforce those restrictions, you had to determine if an individual actually had access to adequate temporary shelter. And the court then went on to say that even when shelter is unavailable, an ordinance prohibiting sitting, lying, or sleeping outside at particular times or in particular locations might be constitutionally permissible. And also an ordinance barring obstruction of public rights-of-ways might be constitutional. So you can see that law enforcement really had they were placed in a pickle, in other words, because they had to try to do this individualized determination or simply not enforce various provisions of their code. And you might well imagine they erred on the side of no enforcement. So walking away from Martin v. Boise, we knew that some time, place, and manner restrictions were okay. We knew enforcement of all code restrictions was acceptable if the individual had access to shelter, and it had to be adequate shelter, it had to be free, and if they had access to adequate shelter but simply chose not to use it, you could still enforce the code. And then obstruction of rights of way might be enforceable. So the next slide, slide 12, it summarizes. So League of Oregon Cities recently issued guidance on homelessness. I believe it was distributed to each counselor. So I know that you're familiar with these A list of direction here. Just to summarize, again, Martin told us that cities can't punish a person experiencing homelessness from sitting, sleeping, or lying on public property when that person has no place else to go. Cities are not required to build or provide shelter for persons experiencing homelessness. Cities can impose traditional prohibitions on sitting, sleeping, lying in public on persons who have access to shelter. And cities are allowed to build or provide shelter. So cities might want to provide that shelter if they want to enforce their code. But it left very unclear what else is an involuntary act or human condition that's an unavoidable consequence of homelessness. So what other actions are protected? What time, place, manner regulations are acceptable? What right-of-way protections are acceptable? And can the city prohibit erecting a structure? That was just left unclear. In response, as I mentioned, some cities stopped enforcing their codes altogether, and some tallied alternative shelters available in their community. Some simply ignored Martin v. Boise. I think Independence tried to walk, and is Chief Mason available? If he's there, he can explain
Yes,
what the current enforcement status is right now.
Chief Mason is in the room, and would you care to comment, Chief? And you'll need to use the microphone, please.
Sure. Our current enforcement practice is to enforce no overnight use of our parks exclusively. That's the only area that we really enforce camping. Sitting, laying, lying, overnight use of our parks is the only place that we do that. We do have people that are in public space that are camping in our public spaces that aren't parks, and we don't do any enforcement in those areas.
Did you get that, Carrie?
I sure did. Thanks so much. So so Independence is in the situation as most Oregon cities right now, where you're taking a selective public property management approach, and have yet really to audit your code and make these public policy choices that Independence is just starting the process to undertake. So slide 13, Lake v. City of Grants Pass, because Martin left so many unclear parameters. It didn't give us a bright line test, so City of Grants Pass thought, well, we're going to try to comply with Martin, and we think that we can craft an ordinance around Martin. So they put themselves out there as a test case, and that decision, which is currently on appeal to the Ninth Circuit, provides us some parameters. They may change when the Ninth Circuit acts, but it clarified a couple things. Martin v. Boise involved only criminal sanctions. Blake clarified no, civil penalties as well as criminal penalties are both unconstitutional. Blake evaluated what does keeping warm and dry mean, and it includes you were not allowed to penalize somebody for having bedding, sleeping bag, or other material. People are entitled to stay warm and dry under Blake. And most importantly, Blake's decision gave us a little more guidance on what is alternative shelter. It didn't tell us what it is, but they told us what it's not. And we learned that it is not a church-affiliated entity with strict rules that requires mandatory church attendance, particularly if that is against the individual's religious belief. It doesn't include federal BLM land, Josephine County land, or state rest stops, which have restrictions placed on them, making a homeless individual's use not feasible. And it doesn't include warming shelters if they don't have beds available or they're not available consistently throughout the year, which warming shelters are not. And then we already talked about the civil or criminal penalties. So it sort of clarifies the reach of Martin. Let's move to slide 14. So in my opinion, what I use Blake for is when communities talk about low barrier alternative shelters, we point to Blake as explaining what low barrier might be. League of Oregon Cities guidance took that and interpreted it in a really helpful way. So low barrier or alternative shelter can't eliminate individuals because of gender, age, disability, or familial status. You can't require individuals to submit themselves to religious teaching. The shelter can't have a durational limit, so either you can't, many shelters say you can be here for a week, but after that you need to find alternative shelter for 30 days before you're allowed to come back in. So those kinds of durational limits don't qualify as alternative shelter. Similarly, shelters that require check-in prior to 8 p.m. also don't qualify as alternative shelters that are adequate to allow a municipality to enforce their public property management laws. And then also, critical to a low barrier shelter, they can't prohibit access if an individual is under the influence of a substance like drugs or alcohol, or because of past criminal behavior. So the reason that this explanation is helpful is because it gives cities guidance on what type of alternative shelter does need to be available, what type of low barrier shelter needs to be available in order to enforce public property occupation prohibition. Moving to slide 15. In 2021, the legislature decided they wanted to codify Martin and Blake. And the reason I think they did that was first to just try to clearly state and synthesize this sort of amorphous case law. But also the Oregon legislature doesn't want Martin and Blake to go away in the event the federal Supreme Court, for instance, decides that these types of public property prohibitions are constitutional. So regardless of what happens at the federal level, we now have them, Blake and Martin, codified in our state law. So it didn't really add much. HB 3115 now set forth in ORA 195.530. It's called non-camping use of public lands. And like I said, it basically synthesizes the case law to date, Martin and Boise. What it clarifies is that keeping warm and dry includes measures necessary to survive outdoors. However, it doesn't include safety regulations involving fire or flame. So a city regulation that is talking about open flame in public parks could still be enforced under 3115. Public property includes city property, state property. It doesn't include federal land. So 3115 doesn't apply to federal land. And one of the critical aspects of 3115 is that it will evaluate city ordinances and city code provisions from the perspective of a homeless individual. So it needs to be prohibitions, time, place, and manner prohibitions on sitting, lying, sleeping, or keeping warm and dry outdoors must be objectively reasonable to persons experiencing homelessness. That involves the totality of the circumstances. So what this does is that any one law has to be reviewed from every individual, including all of the factors going into its enforcement. Who it's being enforced against, when it's being enforced, what other shelters might be available in that moment. The totality of circumstances really widens the lens on how enforcement moves forward. And adding a little edge to it, so that is, everything that I've just talked about is exactly what Martin and Blake already imposed on your city. But what HB 3115 adds is that it goes into effect in a year, July 1st, 2023. After that point, if you have regulations in your code that are not objectively reasonable to persons experiencing homelessness, they have to notify you, they provide you with a written 90-day notice, and if the code language doesn't change, even if you haven't enforced it against anyone, so if it's just there and you're not enforcing it, you're subject to a legal challenge, and you may be required to pay the challenger's attorney's fees. So that provides us with a real incentive to get down to brass tacks and start looking at your code provisions closely to ensure that any amendments that are required based on the totality of the circumstances are in place in a year, July 1st next year. So next slide 16. So the minimum the city is required to do under case law and statute, the first prong, these sanctions for camping, sleeping on public property, no alternative shelter is available. That's under the case law. And then as we talked about, HB 3115 requires the amendment a year from now to ensure that code language doesn't unconstitutionally regulate sitting, lying, sleeping, or keeping warm and dry outdoors on public property.
Can you remind me what sanctions mean in this context?
Did somebody just ask what the sanctions are?
Yeah, what does sanctions mean?
What do sanctions mean in this context?
So sanctions are civil or criminal penalties imposed on individuals. So law enforcement could ask somebody, could you please move, this park is closed? But if that individual, who is probably well informed of their rights, refuses to comply with that request, and an officer issues a citation that imposes either criminal or civil penalties, so some amount of money as a fine for violating enforced city code, that is that could be an unconstitutional sanction. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Keep rolling.
Okay, keep it rolling. Okay, so slide 17, we move on to examining not necessarily problematic provisions in your code, but provisions of your code that jumped out at me as a good starting point for the conversation, that may illustrate some of the points that we've talked about. So, I guess as a preliminary point, in response to HB 3115, which is now ORS 195530, our office audited the City of Independence Code. We didn't find a lot of problematic provisions, so that's good. But that audit and the review was on hold for multiple reasons, as you might imagine. And so we're picking it up now. So IMC 26375 is just an example of the code provisions we'll be talking about. How you want to enforce it, whether you want to enforce it, do you want to amend it, are you required to amend it, whether you're required to amend it is going to depend on, like I said, the totality of circumstances. So what other alternative shelters are available? What other measures is the city taking to ensure that its code and one of its code is constitutional? So IMC 26375 prohibits overnight use of parks. It's unlawful for anyone to set up tents or other temporary shelters, or to use house trailers, campers, RVs, or automobiles for overnight camping in any city park without first obtaining written consent from the city manager. So my analysis, as we will talk about this, again, I'm not saying that this code provision violates HB 3115. 3115, as you recall, targets non-camping use of public land. However, if the definition of camping here is too broad, like it was in Blake, a court might find that this is unconstitutional, depending on whether other alternatives are available in the city and other circumstances. For instance, how hard is it to get city manager consent? Does it cost money? Is it acceptable to sleep outside without structures, either on city park or on public property? So those are the factors that we will be looking at to determine whether to enforce IMC 26-375, whether to amend it, etc. So moving to the next slide, IMC 26-378 sets forth a pretty standard exclusionary provision. So anyone who violates the prior code provision actually can be excluded as a prong of the penalty from any or all city parks for a period of not more than 30 days. So I know, and I regularly advise cities, if you're gonna issue an exclusion order, you want a right of appeal to accompany that order. And the LOC guidance echoes my standard recommendation. They state that an exclusion order must include the right of appeal, and that if an appeal is requested, the exclusion is stayed during that period of time. So we're going to be talking about IMC 26-378 as we move forward, again, about how and whether to enforce it or amend it. Slide 19. So the easiest course under the current law, some cities are choosing to simply omit, amend, repeal sections that have any smell, any whiff of unconstitutionality. So like, we don't want to think about this. We're just going to take those out of our code. We don't want to talk about alternatives. We don't want to think about the panoply of options that might be available, but we also don't want to get sued. So we're just cutting those. So that kind of minimum action would result in camping, sleeping, lying, and keeping warm and dry would be allowed in all outdoor public property within the city, including parks, rights-of-way, sidewalks, and planting strips. Most of my cities do not want to see people camping in their rights-of-ways, blocking their sidewalks, in their planting strips. As the mayor was talking about initially, this is involved a balancing between all citizens' rights and use of public spaces. So slide 20 is an evaluation of that ability to regulate rights of way, which we know under all three sources of law, Martin, Blake, and HB 3115, you're allowed to have objectively reasonable time, place, and manner regulations. Is Section 1860 of the Independence Code reasonable? It says obstruction of passageways is not allowed. No person shall obstruct or assist in obstructing pedestrian or vehicular traffic on a sidewalk or street. And so my opinion is that that's probably a reasonable time, place, and manner regulation. It's not prohibiting obstruction of all public property. It's focusing on areas that all citizens need to use for safe access. And slide 21 calls out, my assessment. It provides the basis for my assessment that IMC 1860 is probably constitutional, even though it is one of those provisions that would be flagged by somebody providing a code audit as possibly problematic. So objectively reasonable time, place, manner regulations. With regard to persons experiencing homelessness, you can prohibit blocking sidewalks and right-of-ways. You can prohibit safety risks, including regulating fire and flames. You can impose overnight limits in some but not all city parks. You can enforce reasonable parking limits with notice. And then, as I've said several times, providing alternatives, not necessarily the city, but having alternative shelter sites within your community improves the totality of circumstances, allowing you to enforce these types of regulations. So I just want to emphasize again, there's a spectrum of options, enforcement and restrictions allowing management of city public property increases with the increase in alternative temporary shelters. Temporary shelters under current state law can be provided by private property owners, social services, or city-supported efforts.
I had a question.
Yes.
Alternative shelters, if you have someone camping, say, in the park or the beauty strips along streets or something like that, out in the open, can an alternative shelter just be out in the open area that's away from that? Or do you have to have some sort of structure? What is required for alternative shelters? If the city were to provide
So
it.
if you're going to actually provide that's funny, that's my next slide. So slide 22.
Okay, sorry.
Talks about the slide itself talks about camping and allowing camping in the roadway. But my notes on this, there's two different ways of allowing camping in ORS 95. And it allows camping in vehicles on private property. So the city could set up a program by which private individuals come to the city and say, I want to permit one family or two families perhaps to set up tents in my backyard or park in my driveway. And, sorry, phone is freaking out. Park in my driveway, and that would be alternative shelter that the city could count on as available. You also could open up a parking lot, for instance, a city public parking lot, allowing camping in vehicles so that RVs could park there. But the requirement is that those locations must provide access to sanitation facilities, and sanitation facilities must include, at the very least, toilets, hand washing, and trash refuse services. So you can't simply funnel individuals into an area without taking care of those individuals. And that's, it's kind of, without providing a location where individuals have some level of service, it's hard to preclude people from areas, public areas in the city.
But it
I don't
wouldn't.
know if that answered your question.
It wouldn't. It wouldn't necessarily mean that you have to have a covered shelter or some other rain preventative, snow preventative, weather preventative structure.
No, actually, no. You don't have to provide a shelter like that. It will add to your totality of circumstances. So the better the situation, the more likely you can enforce restrictions on other public areas. And so the way I like to think about it is if you're going to close certain public areas from camping, you want to be sure that individuals either aren't being funneled somewhere that is unsanitary or where trouble's going to break out. What many cities try to say, well, we're going to preclude camping or sleeping warm and dry, in all of our parks except one. We're not going to provide any services in that one park, but we're going to say that that is alternative shelter, and they can all go there. And I can tell you for a fact that the totality of circumstances does not lend itself to saying that's an objectively reasonable restriction, time, place, and manner restriction.
And Carrie, I think it's important too to note that shelter management is key to a successful sheltering solution. Without any organization or oversight, particularly co-located with services, that's where we have the best chance of being successful.
I completely agree. That's where I've seen this be the most successful in communities such as Medford, Beaverton, Gresham. They're all a little ahead of the rest of us. But there is a high level of controversy around either paying for that kind of management or otherwise just how is it going to be available? How is it going to be financially feasible? And so there's tension between doing the highest, best level of service, which is going to ensure you can enforce your code as written? And where is that, there's the tension between city resources and protection of public property for the good of all, which is why you guys get paid the big bucks to do that balancing.
So this is a little frustrating because it feels like our hands are totally tied and we just have to do whatever has to be done to accommodate a small percentage of the population versus the rest of us. And are you sure it's not in the Constitution, although I haven't seen most of this in our Constitution, that people don't have the right to warm food? So are you sure that fire and, heating appliances are not written somewhere in our Constitution?
I don't know about the Constitution, but I know that HB 3115 that implemented the the only two constitutional cases that we have on this point, specifically says you may regulate fire.
Then we should probably start doing that here.
Because right there is the balancing between safety. There can be open flame in grassy areas that are dry, grassy areas. The city needs to be able to protect its public spaces from fire, wildfire.
Right. Carrie, why don't you continue, since you have only one more slide here, and then we'll go to if there's any questions that need to be answered at this point, because there's a whole lot of information we've been getting.
There is a lot of information, yes, and I apologize that I can't synthesize it perfectly for you, nor can I give you any clear answers. I can just tell you what we know at the time. It is changing and evolving, and so will your options. They will continue to evolve. Maybe somebody's going to come up with the perfect blueprint, but there is no such blueprint right now. And so just finish with that slide 22. This is an example of an allowance the city might choose to adopt that allows camping in your right-of-way, and that could add to that totality of circumstances that then again allows you to enforce various code provisions, because you can point to areas where individuals are allowed to sit, sleep, keep warm and dry, while protecting other areas in the manner you choose. So the final slide, 23, while I can help you with what the law does say, it poses a number of policy choices. And the first is going to be, minimum code amendments to officially meet the law and protect or enhance the quality of life and independence. So we could just strike the provisions that I was talking about, and you could call it good. To address the counselor's point that you feel backed into a corner and you need to provide shelter, that is not what the law is saying, and that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that is a possibility. It's one response that certainly would allow you to manage your public lands elsewhere. The presentation isn't intended to scare you or imply that there are any specific steps that your council must take. I'm trying to raise policy choices for you to consider to decide how to proceed based on your community's needs. But what I do want to say, of course, is that anything we decide that is unconstitutional, we're going to take out of your code between now and July 1st. And any measures you choose to implement between now and then could result in being able to retain and enforce certain provisions that otherwise might need to be removed. So as the mayor reflected, the next steps are several work sessions to examine your options that are available in your community, consider various city actions, and determine then how those city actions might affect amendments and city enforcement options.
I'm going to add a couple things here, if I might, and then I'm going to turn it over to our city manager to talk briefly about going forward and how she sees that. Just a couple things to consider, that with the Oregon legislature meeting next winter and the implementation a year from now, which is July 1. I know that this issue is on front burners with legislators and I would not be surprised to see some modifications of current state law. I don't know what those modifications might, I don't think anybody knows at this point, but that's working forward. Second thing I would offer, because I join with some of the frustrations that I hear from folks, because we have some, in many ways we have some Hobbesian choices, trying to balance the goods of all and the rights of all, and trying to make this all work in our community. One of the things that I'm hopeful for, and I want to offer a possible light here, that the Polk County Homeless Prevention Group that has been working, Brent and the cities and the county are working together, and I will tell you from being in some of those meetings, there are lots of resources, but they're scattered, and at this point, the state has provided some resources to bring a homeless prevention coordinator on to try to, under one understanding of the resources available, so that, as Brent pointed out, some people came in, they needed a gas card, and then they got other resources to get themselves situated and in a better situation. I'm very hopeful after a number of meetings that this is an opportunity where this could be a way to assist with some of the demands. I don't know how it's all going to sort out, but I just wanted to offer some optimism. And I'm going to turn it over to City Manager West to talk just for a moment on how she sees the process of moving forward to deal with some of this. And then if any people have any additional questions, we can do that. We ain't going to solve everything tonight. City Manager.
We are not solving everything tonight. This is a big issue. So we're looking at the next work session, most likely in late August. We will have Carrie as a large part of this. We haven't set a date as yet. We'll be working with you to get that date. Carrie will be able to drive, we hope, by August, and having her in person would make this a lot easier. In the meantime, Chief Mason, Carrie, and I will be working behind the scenes to put together as many creative options, ideas, concepts as we can to bring it to you at a work session. That'll be the first pass-through, where we'll all talk about and determine what your policy, how you want to move forward. We'll have at least one more work session, potentially 2 or 3, until we work through this. This is going to take as many work sessions as you need to create the policies that we can put in place to comply and that work for our community. So be looking for your first one in August, and then as many as we need after that.
Are there any other clarification questions that at this point? Please.
I have one, but I think Councilor Kaur might be able to answer it. When you said the cost of housing, no more than 30% of their income, does that include, and this is probably silly, but does that include like principal, property taxes, all that stuff, or is that, when they look at it?
You're talking primarily renters in
Okay.
that scenario.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we got a dose of what the issues are and what the rules are. Carrie, I appreciate you taking the time and the resources that that Carrie's put together, and then the League of Oregon Cities. I think we shared that already. That's a pretty heavy document with lots of details in it. So, okay, we've started. If it was easy,
Congratulations.
Thank you. If it was easy, somebody else would already do it. So.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And just know that nobody else has solved this problem, which is why it's landing in your lap.
Right.
It was left up in the air for too long until the crisis was where we are now.
Right. So without objection, I'm going to keep us moving because we have a couple of other things we can do, and then I'll have something at the end.
Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you, Carrie.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. Yes?
I'm going to go ahead and disconnect you unless you want to stay on and listen to the rest of the meeting.
I'm done. Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Irvine, I think you have the next two. I think you have the next 2 items. One's an information report and one's an action item.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor and Council. So here to talk real quick, give you an update on the sports park feasibility study process that we've been going on. It took a little while to spin up, unfortunately, but got the consultants out here in mid-May to do a stakeholder visit, site visit. They've gotten all their background information, talked to a bunch of different folks about the different sports activities that are going on both in the community and in the region. Right now they're nailing down the market needs for sports, both for sort of the local community and again, sort of in terms of tournaments, what types of tournaments we might be able to attract. Next step is really going to be to use that information to settle on a proposed layout or mix of fields at the sports park. To do that, actually probably it's going to be in early July, after July 4th, we're going to do a design charrette with the stakeholders to essentially kind of almost play like a puzzle game. You know, we've got this property, we've got this kind of demand for these kinds of fields. Let's see what fits where and how, and then we're going to hopefully ideally come out of that with one preferred design. There's a decent chance we'll come out of it with two alternatives, and then they're going to take that and use that to develop construction costs and operational analysis, maintenance needs, all of those types of expenses that would go along with that type of a facility. We've got about 50 acres. Obviously, you have the 3 soccer fields already there, as well as the access road. So there's going to be some limitations on what can be fit in where. And so that's going to be, I think, the nut that the design charrette is going to try to crack. I forgot to mention, we're going to do the design charrette, come up with some ideas, then we're actually going to put that out to the public because we want to make sure to vet this with the community. So we'll take a couple weeks after the design charrette to say, hey, here's the 1 or 2 designs that we think make the most sense. What do you all think? And then based on that feedback, we're going to tweak it into the final designs that we're going to work with. So that's, I think, a quick summary of where we're at. I think we're making good progress now. And as I said, I think there's some constraints, but still they say there's a lot of good opportunity to work with more of a sort of a, Willamette Valley, sort of, what I consider to be regional tournaments, kind of regional within Oregon. But we probably have to limit expectations about kind of the larger, like people coming from out of state and that type of a thing. But definitely, they see a lot of need locally for sports fields of all types. They think there's some opportunity for tournament as well, but they're recommending we look at kind of local needs first and then see kind of how that also fits with the opportunity to bring tournaments to the area. That's my summary for now. Be happy to answer any questions.
They knew that coming into this, though, that we had no intention of building Omaha here.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. They come from that scale, and so they always kind of are talking about, okay, well, if you had 100 acres, you could do this, but you don't. So here's what you can do.
Right.
Sean, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, please.
Does the feasibility study take into consideration the impacts to parking and traffic and whatnot, as well as the design?
Yeah, that's going to be kind of all factored in is, okay, maybe we can squeeze in 15 fields, but what's that going to do to parking,
Okay.
And I think you said this as well, but they're also going to tell us the economic impact that if we have this park, what it will do to our economy.
Yeah, they're going to give some estimates about, the type of use it would get, the numbers it might bring, that type of thing.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, I think you have another item in front of us today.
Yes. So I have a resolution requesting your approval for a resolution to apply for an Oregon Department of Energy Community Renewable Energy Grant. This is a new program the legislature created last year. They want to essentially encourage more planning and development of renewable energy projects within the state. We see a lot of potential opportunity here, and frankly, some good alignment with some of the city goals. I'm going to I think I'm going to talk about this the opposite way I wrote my staff report, but in talking about renewable energy and offsetting energy costs at public facilities, we immediately began looking at the Independence Lagoons, our wastewater lagoons. They've got a lot of property, so there's some excess property off to the side that can potentially be utilized for solar panels. And there's also a lot of pumps and other equipment there that use a lot of power and that have opportunity to be offset in terms of the cost, the energy that's used to run those things. What we think is really interesting is there's an opportunity also to create storage, energy storage, so we could generate electricity with solar and store it on site to be able to use that to power the equipment on the property. So in addition to making a cleaner, cleaner footprint emissions-wise, it's a great resiliency play because if the power goes out for multiple days at a time, we do have diesel generators for backup, but this would be a great alternative way to create essentially hedge our bets more for an emergency so that we don't, we're not just relying on diesel generators. Now we have a different way to operate our wastewater system, one of our water pumps, a sewer lift station, that's all on that property. So that's our primary goal, is to do a planning grant to explore, kind of the feasibility, costs, sort of footprint that this would need to go on, spec out all of the different materials and systems that would be needed, and really kind of figure out that. Ideally, there will be enough funding in this planning grant to also be able to look at other public facilities. The South Well Fields would be my second target. That also has a decent bit of land area that might be able to accommodate a similar type of a setup. And then we have, the museum and the library that have roofs that we could put solar on top of. Consultant costs these days are pretty wild, so we're kind of hedging our bets and saying, the Lagoons is our number one focus. And then depending on how bids come back, if we are awarded this grant, we would then try to expand the project to these other locations. The grant, you're able to ask for up to $100,000 for a planning grant. There is zero cash match required, so it's just the staff time to manage the project, which is one of the reasons why we're really excited about it. The other part that's really exciting is for resilience projects, which this energy storage system would be. That is also, they have a construction grant of up to $1 million to fund those types of projects, and that also does not have a match. So if we do this planning grant, we get it all spec'd out, we figure out the costs involved, we can then put in for a construction grant to potentially get it built at no cost to the city. So that's the resolution I'm asking for, is to apply for the planning grant. And so if everything goes well with planning, I'll be back to you to ask for a construction grant sometime in the future.
Questions for Mr. Irvine?
How much city time do you anticipate this taking?
Honestly, the planning part is mostly just engineers running numbers, so it won't, it'd be a few hours, just kind of telling them what we need, going over their proposals, and then just getting the specs. So that part of it would be pretty straightforward. The construction project, if we went to that, would be a little more intensive, but we manage those pretty frequently.
Everybody okay? If someone would like to make a motion, I'd appreciate it.
I move to approve Resolution 22-1568 as presented. Is that right?
Second.
Did I read that right?
Is that acceptable, Karen?
Yes, as long as you're recognizing that it is the
There's extra,
amended one
yeah,
that was submitted.
yeah. There's extra words in there, but that's okay. I have a motion
Second.
and a second by Martin Willis. Discussion. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
And opposed? Motion carries. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Under announcements tonight, I have something, and so does anybody have any last-minute announcements before I get to my item, please?
I have one thing.
Please.
Joan Setniker, who is going up for the Pan American Weightlifting Championships from Independence, Oregon, took first. So she is a Pan American champion. Amazing job, Joan Setniker.
Wow. Congratulations. Okay. Karen, would you read the resolution, please?
A resolution commending Robert Mason's service as interim city manager of the city of Independence. Resolution number 22-1569. Whereas the City Council of the City of Independence, from time to time, commends various people for outstanding services to the city, and whereas Police Chief Robert Bob Mason accepted the role as interim city manager in November 2021 and faithfully performed the duties of the office until a permanent city manager was appointed. Now, therefore, it is hereby resolved by the City of Independence as follows. Section 1. Let it be known to all that Bob Mason demonstrated professionalism, passion, and energy in service to the City of Independence, and has the grateful thanks from all for taking on this additional responsibility and keeping Independence moving forward. Section 2, let it be further known that he executed the duties and responsibilities of the position of interim city manager with excellence, dedication, and humor, and the same is greatly appreciated by the mayor, city council, city staff, and the residents of the community. Done this 28th day of June, 2022.
If someone would move the resolution, I'd appreciate it.
Move to approve?
Second.
And a second. Is there discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
And opposed. Motion carries. And now I get to present this to Mr. Mason, and then we get to cheer.
And we get to eat.
On behalf of all of us, you've done great work. You're a credit to your profession, to yourself, your community. Thank you for all you've done for making Independence a better place. We're so proud that you're part of Team Independence. Congratulations.
Thanks, Mayor.
And we have cupcakes, and the cops can
So
have
let's
one.
adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
All in favor? Aye. Cupcakes.
Cupcakes.